anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, good. Hello, welcome to 108 Contemporary. I'm Kathy McCrees. We're so excited to have you here and to have Sean Anderson here from MoMA in New York City. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you. And thanks to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities at the University of Tulsa and Tara and Sean for bringing Sean here, and for so many other of the programs that you do in the community. And I don't know if you noticed, but we have a brightly colored home outside that strategically matches the panels in the gallery. And thanks to Taylor and Painter Wolf, I think she's probably still out there, but she'll be here for a while. So if you didn't get a chance to go through and have not seen it, it's kind of fun to go through and fantasize about living that small, right? Okay, and hope you've been enjoying Shelter, Rachel Hayes and Patrick Doherty's exhibition. Rachel is here today. If you haven't met her, she may be out in the tiny house. There's Rachel. Rachel, I just gave a nod to you, so she's glad to talk to you about her project. If you haven't met her, she's a wonderful person. And Patrick Doherty is going to be in town in about a week, I think. It's about a week, Holbrook. Installing one of these. They won't look like any of these, but he's installing a sticks works down at the Chapman 6th and Chapman Green at 6th and Boston. And then he'll be here on March 8th to give a gallery talk and to do a book signing. So please come back for that. We are celebrating 5 years in the Tulsa Arts District here at 108 Contemporary. Thanks to those of you who have supported us along the way, and we have some beautiful special chocolates from Glacier that you're welcome to take. They're at the front desk, courtesy of Myra. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce and welcome Sean Latham. He's the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, and he will introduce our guest speaker.
Trying to get to a place where everybody can see me. I feel like this is such a neat space to be having an event like this, and we're very happy to be here and very grateful to 108 Contemporary for helping us host and organize this event. So I want to say just a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities before we get going, and then I'll introduce today's speaker. So if you don't know anything about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, we've been around a little bit less, actually, a couple fewer years than 108. We're about 4 years old now, and our mission is to emphasize the importance of the arts and humanities for the healthy sort of civic and social and artistic life, spiritual life of the city of Tulsa. And we do that in 2 ways. Each year we organize a theme, and we work all kinds of programs around that theme. We begin by organizing a research group on campus that's made up of students and faculty members, as well as members of the public that are invited to apply for these fellowships. And that group does all kinds of interesting research. They meet once a week and organize all kinds of things. And then in addition, we use that theme to carry that work and some of those ideas out into the larger community. And in the process, end up organizing about 30 to 40 public programs every year, including one like this. So this year our theme is home and homelands, a topic that's very much on all of our minds and is certainly sort of charged in all kinds of, I think, political and personal ways at the moment. So we've been organizing a variety of different events around that, and I just want to give you some sense of a few things we have coming up, just to give you a sense of the sort of broader part of our mission here. So next week, on Thursday night, and that's March 1st at 7 o'clock on TU's campus, we'll be hosting a talk by a woman named Lisa Lindsay from the University of North Carolina. Her talk is titled Atlantic Bonds, an Odyssey from America to Africa. That's the fascinating story of a freed slave from South Carolina. The son of a slave from South Carolina who went to Africa, was actually captured and held in Africa, escaped, and then became one of the continent's leading political and civil rights figures. And so she tells this remarkable story of this journey back to Africa and all of the sort of heartbreak and triumph that goes with it. On the 10th of March, every year we always organize an event with Philbrook Museum, Tulsa Symphony, and Portico Dance Company. So that's their second Saturday. The museum, of course, will be free at Philbrook, and we'll be doing a special series of interlocked art, music, and dance events called Songs America Loves to Sing, that really think about the relationship between song, memory, and home. We've got other things coming up. For example, at the end of March, on the 30th and 31st, we'll be organizing a performance of the musical Oklahoma. at Gilcrease Museum, but done with an all-black cast in order to help us think about the ways in which that musical both represents and misrepresents aspects of our state identity, and also to help us think about the history of Oklahoma's all-black towns. On the 5th of April, we're going to have a home movie festival at Circle Cinema. We've been gathering home movies from all across Tulsa, converting them into film, and so for 2 hours that night, we'll have these very brief film clips that will give you a kind of hidden view of all kinds of secret archives that have been hidden of film all around Tulsa. And one of our last programs of the year will be on the 14th of April when we take over Gilcrease Museum for a day and host an event called Native Cuisines that's about the relationship between home, food, and native sovereignty issues, where we talk about the role in which food in particular plays in the cultivation of healthy communities and the ways in which it helps preserve ideas of cultural identity and memory. So there'll be a special meal by Takabe. This is a well-known Native American restaurant in Denver. They'll come to cook a special meal on Friday night at Gilcrease, and throughout the day we'll have a series of panels, events, health screenings, and even some specially catered lunches, so you can try all kinds of different contemporary Native cuisines from local chefs. So part of the idea, or part of our focus on the idea of home and homelands over the course of this last year has led us to think quite hard about the physical and material objects we inhabit, and that's why it's so great to have this little house out here. Our homes, of course, are not just dwelling spaces or sites of shelter, but lived human spaces. Right? There are archaeologies of our lives, our families, and our memories. To move through a home is often to move backward and forward in time, from baby pictures and knickknacks to dirty dishes and sticky note reminders. They're vital living spaces, but they're also quite fragile ones. War, natural disaster, economic struggles, and changes in our family lives can abruptly upend and even destroy such spaces. What then might happen to home if we found ourselves thrust from these places? What is home when it's reduced to its barest essentials? I began thinking about these questions when I was lucky enough to visit two extraordinary shows. One in Amsterdam called Solution or Utopia, designed for refugees. It was sponsored in part by the UNHCR Refugee Challenge as well as Ikea, and it invited contemporary designers and architects to create shelters, clothing, and other objects for refugees, ranging from emojis conveying things like safe, hungry, or at sea, to clothing that could convert to tents and inflatable emergency shelters. The second show was curated by our guest today, and it just closed at MoMA, New York, titled Insecurities, and it will be the subject of today's talk. It too explores the idea of shelter in a world where over 60 million people are displaced and often in hazardous movements in dangerous environments. The show invited us to think about design and architecture in interlinked ways, to focus our thinking on a world defined as much by impermanence, insecurity, and movement as by home and a settled human environment. So after seeing these shows, it seemed like an essential part of our work when we're thinking about home and homelands this year to bring to Tulsa somebody to help us think through these ideas. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Sean Anderson to the city as part of our own ongoing collaboration with 108 Contemporary, and especially as part of this whole interlock series of events here called Shelter. Sean is the Associate Curator in the Department of Design and Architecture at MoMA, a post he's held for just over 2 years. He has degrees in Architecture and Design from Cornell and Princeton, and a PhD in Art History from UCLA. He's held, I learned last night, teaching posts all over the world and architectural design postings all over the world in places ranging from Australia and the United States to Qatar, right? And Afghanistan. I didn't want to leave out Kabul, including a year in Kabul, working on redesigning or preserving or creating a preservation plan for the old city in Afghanistan in somewhat hazardous and I imagine stressful circumstances. And he's now, after all of those travels, found a home at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and he's graciously actually spent all yesterday meeting with students throughout the city. He held meetings with high school students at Booker T. Washington High School yesterday, as well as our museum students and art students and arts management students at the University of Tulsa. So we're fortunate, I think, very fortunate indeed to have him here in Tulsa, and I hope you'll welcome me in welcoming Sean Anderson.
Hi, everyone. They have a chair here for me to sit down at, but I don't really speak well when I'm sitting. So I have to thank Sean and Tara for this very kind introduction and the kind invitation to come to Tulsa this weekend. It's been a great pleasure to meet everyone here, especially the students at the University of Tulsa, as well as at Booker T. Washington High School. I've certainly learned a lot from all of them, in as much as I hope to learn how to noodle at some point in the future. That might not happen now, and I'm happy to say that the sun has come out today as well to join us in this talk today. So I hope everyone can hear me. I'm not very good on a microphone, but I wanted to begin today with a set of questions that had been in some ways haunting me when I was teaching and working in Australia. And I will talk a little bit about that in the middle of my talk. But it was a set of questions that I think that Sean has spoken to. Which is, the first question would be, when does shelter become home? You could reverse that question by asking, when is shelter home? And second, when does shelter become home in the midst of transit? So we have today over 65.7 million people in transit. These figures are based on UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as a number of economic bodies that are located within the UN that monitor the movements of individuals, of families across the world. Not all of these individuals are escaping famine or war or conflict, as it may be, but they are also escaping a lack of resources. In many cases, water, access to water, access to food. And then further, if you take that kind of condition further, you also have an escape, if you will, from economic intransigency, right? How economics of a particular area or region has prevented individuals from living in their homes. And so when we think of the construction of home from an architectural standpoint, we might think of something similar in shape to these structures. These are structures that are about to become refugee settlements in the El Zatri refugee camp in Lebanon, in Jordan. And then I just wanted to include this quote by the Nobel Prize-winning author Mahfouz, who says, "Home is not where you were born. Home is where all your attempts to escape cease." So when you are in a constant state of escape, where can home begin? So I wanted to foreground this afternoon's conversation and discussion with not necessarily facts and not necessarily images that we may or may not have seen in the media, but actually a kind of condition, if you will, a condition that has been happening more or less in the public eye, but not really discussed in the United States until fairly recently. When I came into the museum about 2.5 years ago, I was asked to make an exhibition proposal and immediately came upon this topic because it was something that I had been working on for some time. And I began with a set of ideas around what a line means. What is a line in space? That a line in space, a line on a piece of paper, could be considered one of the most violent things that we can do. A line drawn in the sand divides. It creates an us and a them. It creates a here and a there. but it also opens up an infinite number of spaces that possibly can bring us together. So these lines that we are drawing, these lines across America that we are drawing and re-inscribing over and over, both historically as well as today, signal, for me at least, as an architect, what do these spaces, these infinite spaces of division, start to create? And when we look at the lines, if you will, the trajectories and vectors of individuals, millions of individuals moving across, for instance, the African continent in search of home, in search of safety, in particular in Western Europe. Some of them reach Western Europe, some of them clearly don't. That these lines and these trajectories start to take on a different significance, in that all of these people are transiting vast amounts of space, entire continents, entire seas, in order to locate themselves, to find themselves home. If we take those lines a little bit further and say that a line is also a border system, if you will, we could look at how borders, in effect, have, in the last 50 years or so, been transforming the very nature of the landscape and the very nature of how we understand territory and the territories in which we live. So in this case, this is a satellite image. It's a little hard to see in the light, but it's a satellite image of the border system between the Principality of Ceuta, which is a Spanish territory, that divides northern Morocco from the Mediterranean. Ceuta is a very small principality. It's an extension from Spain. And it is one of the most heavily militarized zones on the planet, in an effort to keep people out, not to keep people in. So you can imagine that a person would arrive by any means possible at this 3 layers of razor wire, 16-foot high walls, and attempt to constantly get over that line, to transgress that line, to build a new way of getting over that line. So border systems are as much built as they are lines in the landscape that cut and they divide. Of course, this has also been in the news more locally. These are the 8 prototypes of the border wall that will be proposed for dividing Mexico from the United States. And so when these violent lines become built, when they become architectural artifacts, as it were, they start to take on an entirely new significance, because there have to be entire economies that are built in and around these lines and these border systems. And to my knowledge, the most recent choice has been this one, I think, or this one. They're still discussing it, obviously. But we could imagine that the line, the border, is also something that we all share, individuals share. We create borders for ourselves that define us as much as we define the world around us. So these spaces then become something more than us. They become impediments. They become spaces that we attempt continually to transgress or to build, as it may be. They are spaces that speak to desire as much as defiance. Borders used to be also delimited by geography. The sea, for instance, or the ocean. And recently, scholars have started to call the Mediterranean Sea the solid sea, in that the extension of the African continent or the extension of the European continent meet literally on the sea. The sea is no longer impenetrable. It's just a space of extreme violence and danger that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are perishing on a regular basis to reach another shore. So these are, of course, terribly, what's a good word? Terribly sad crises that are happening around the world. But as Sean said, there is a host of design questions that began when we started to see these individuals coming into new nations. And what we found is that the cell phone, the mobile phone, is probably the one and only thing that these people will take with them. Because on their cell phone, they can not only hold their photos, hold their memories, but they can also track themselves. They can communicate with each other. When they're in Libya, they can call a friend who has reached the island of Lampedusa, for instance, the southernmost island of Italy, to make sure that they will be there when they hopefully arrive in their boat. So this is a very striking image. These are individuals who have literally just arrived on the island of Lesbos in Greece. And each of them are taking a picture of the one map that they have of Lesbos so that they can cross from that shore to the opposite shore where there is a refugee center. And I've seen this for myself as well, in which individuals have literally created new pathways across the island of Lesbos by virtue of so many wanting to reach this center. So these lines, in effect, start to create new spaces in the landscape, new spaces in the internet, right? Because we can, in effect, be able to communicate with each other in order to seek out a new destination. These are also new spaces in terms of architecture and how architects, until now, have not actually ever responded to these conditions. And what we have in the case of Greece, for instance, is the former Olympic airport, El Nikan Airport, right on the coast, has become one of the largest refugee centers in Greece, but also in Western Europe. It is still occupied by 5,000 families. Or the abandoned Olympic baseball stadium from 1996, one of 3 stadiums around Athens that have become refugee camps, and it is still being used as a refugee camp. So we start to understand architecture as a threshold. Architecture as designing and building these lines that define where people can go, where people can't go. But also, to some degree, we could argue that these spaces are also something we don't see. They're not publicized. They're not discussed about. They're not discussed unless we have some relationship to that space or to that area of the city. You might say that architects could, in effect, improve upon the conditions of examples like this in Turkey. This is the Kilis II camp. It's considered one of the most technologically advanced camps in Turkey. It's privately run by a corporation, and it houses around 12,000 individuals in metal boxes. These are all individual family units, metal boxes, organized, of course, in a grid. So you might wonder why I would be interested in this. Why would the Museum of Modern Art even be interested in this? And in fact, the museum has had a long history of thinking through the problems of migration, thinking through the problems of displacement. And in fact, one of the original directors of the museum, Alfred Barr, and his wife, Margaret Scolari Barr, were the founders of an organization that eventually became the International Rescue Committee, which is the largest organization charity devoted to refugee causes. In fact, we can find letters in the museum archive that are detailing applications for visas, refugee visas, for artists like Mondrian, for instance, to come and bring their art to the United States. So that's one link. The other link for me, from an architectural and an art standpoint, was that the grid that we start to see organizing these spaces of displacement and despair, the grid that we all talk about when we think about the rationalization of space, the grid that somehow defines and undermines our notions of what modernity and modernism all signifies, the grid here, like the lines that compose that grid, become violent spaces in and of themselves. So I'd like to step back for a moment after that kind of broad, sad, pretty staggering kind of introduction, to look at the ideas that then came forth when I proposed the exhibition. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of how not only the exhibition came to be, but also the ideas that I've been trying to move forward with the exhibition since its closure last year. I was living in Australia and teaching, and I was told by the university that I had to create a research project that was about Australia. It's a very particular notion of Australian scholarship, in that in order to get research funds to do anything, you have to do something about Australia. And I found this quote, and I presented this quote, which was on the cover of the newspaper, with a picture of an asylum seeker. They don't call them refugees in Australia, they call them asylum seekers. And I thought, this is what I'll do my project on. Of course, when I presented this to the senior research body in Sydney, I was not given any money. Because clearly, this was about Australia of a different sort. But I started to think not only about borders and bodies. I was thinking about, what is a boat? Is a boat a house? Is a boat shelter when you are trying to transit an ocean, in this case? And then, what does that mean for society at large when we are so afraid of people who may or may not be trying to live in an area or in around us? What does that mean then for a continent that is also a country? And I found a little discussed, a little unknown component of Australian history, which was created in the 1990s under the label of excision legislation, which by parliamentary law determined that the island continent of Australia, was not Australia. It meant that by parliamentary law, they had excised themselves from the map. So if you were a person on a boat coming from Sri Lanka or Afghanistan or Iraq, crossing the Indian Ocean, and happened to land on one of these islands, generally, Christmas Island and the Cocos Islands, farthest west point of Australian territory, you actually, by law, had not landed in Australia at all. You had landed in a no-man's zone. And that meant that Australia could upend the signatories of the UN Convention on Refugees and transport individuals to any number of locations across the country where they would be held indefinitely until you would choose to go back to where you came from. So this set me off on a journey of proportions that I didn't expect, which was happening around this time, in which boatloads of individuals were coming across the Indian Ocean, being intercepted by this destroyer class boat from the Australian Navy, Often they would be pushed out to sea, which is against the law. They would be pushed out to sea and left to fend for themselves. Or they would get close enough to the landfall of Australian territory and often be set on fire by the Australian Navy. And so you have another view of these kinds of conditions. And when I was working on Christmas Island, you would see these kind of interceptions, as they're called, on a daily basis. And the islanders had become so inured to it, it wasn't a spectacle anymore. And you could sit at the main dock of Christmas Island and watch these interceptions happening. And so I had a student who, it's a little dark image, but you can see all of Southeast Asia and Australia. And what she did for this project was begin to catalog all of the interceptions by boat, all of the capsizing vehicles around the oceans. And you can see as far as boats being pushed back by the Australian Navy into Sri Lankan and Indian waters. So for me, this started to signify another kind of law. A law that is based on lines, a law that is based on invisible lines at sea. And what you start to understand is that this solid sea, if you will, is also owned. It's understood as a space of geopolitics, inasmuch as a space across which people move. And it also, this ocean, defines land as much as land defines the ocean. So 2 islands then were chosen by the Australian government to become the locations for which these refugees and asylum seekers would be taken, usually by plane, owned by a security company, and they would be taken to the island of Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and Nauru Island, the smallest island nation in the South Pacific. They would be taken to camps like this, and the only reason I could go to these places was I carry an American passport. Australians are not allowed, unless you work for one of the companies that keeps these spaces going. And ironically, this is one of the gates in Manus Island. You can see these compounds here along the sea edge. This is a very remote island, so it's about 2 hours from Port Moresby, the capital. And ironically, I found in looking at this particular place, Manus Island, was that it was also the site for an American detention camp in World War II. So they were actually reoccupying American spaces, leasing it from the Papua New Guinea government in exchange for huge amounts of money to the security contracts that were keeping this place going, simply to hold people until they may or may not decide to go home. So there is an architecture to this violence, and there is a violence to the architecture, because over the course of now more than 10 years, there have been several murders, there have been hunger strikes, there have been rapes, etc., etc. So these are spaces in which the people who have tried to reach a home are being denied that. And yet, we know that the Australian government basically hands out $250 million a year just to keep people on this island. To me, it started to signal an idea, a broader idea of how we understand displacement. That we can either accept people into our cities, into our countries, into our nations, or we can always keep them out by some other means. These are the former American barracks on Manus Island, from photos I was taking. Also, temporary shelters and offices, and then, of course, the rubbish heaps that build up over the years to keep these places. To me, this wasn't enough. I then was working with a group to smuggle cell phones into these camps because Australian media was not allowed to take photographs of these camps. So I would smuggle phones into the camps so that the individuals, mostly men, were taking pictures of how they lived. So mind you, it's around 150% humidity. There are crocodiles nearby. And they're living in plastic and polyethylene tents. And that is the fence that divides crocodiles from humans. And then just to give you a sense of the kind of other landscape of the island, Lorengau is the principal village. And about once every 2 weeks, they would take the one bus out for individuals. These were locked buses, unair conditioned, and they would be driven around the island to be shown what they were missing by being forced to live in the refugee camp. And they called them lovingly culture tours. Similarly, then I started interviewing the architects, the Australian architects who were being commissioned to build these facilities. This is then cut out of the middle of the jungle for housing approximately 10,000 people. And then lastly, about Manus, I just give you a sense then that there's an infrastructure that is being designed and built to maintain this division. This is a 5-story high boat for the Australian officials who would come and live here. It has a movie theater, a rock climbing wall, a disco, a bar, they're Australian, a cafeteria, etc. And it was built on a barge because it was thought that if any of the people who were to leave the camp or escape the camp, that they could go to sea immediately, the Australians. So all of this is not to burden you, but it's more a sense of the things that I was thinking about and looking at, because when you take this, I would say this is the most extreme example I've seen, and you magnify it across the planet, you start to understand what are these systems that governments and individuals are building, and therefore what is the architecture of these systems that defy kind of logic. So just briefly, this is the island of Nauru. It's about 2.5 miles long by 1 mile wide. All of the kind of development, if you will, is on the edge. And this is the camp. Australia gives around $300 million a year to Nauru to maintain this camp that has 1,000 men, women, and children in it. And therefore has to have air flights that come in on a regular basis for food, etc. But again, kind of irony for me, this is Nauru being bombed during the war. And it was one of the most wealthy countries in the world per capita because it's basically an island of phosphorus. And it was the world's supplier of fertilizer for many years. In fact, we were talking last night that Nauru had the highest per capita Rolls-Royce population in the world for many years. There you see the camp. This is about as close as any journalist has ever been to Nauru. So they're all living in tents. Here, these are mine. So they're covering the tents with a metallic kind of polyethylene cover so that the sun reflects and it's not as hot. And just very briefly, this is one of the most violent sites of protest. These are men who went on a hunger strike a few years ago in order to be seen, as it were. And they were sewing their mouths shut so they couldn't eat. So all of this is to say that these individuals were attempting to locate themselves in a home. They were attempting to find home in a country and in a landscape that has ample room and ample places to accommodate them, and yet because of politics and because of kind of geopolitical movements, Australia decided to keep them out. So this is a poster that is seen all around the Indian Ocean in every language, from Portuguese in Mozambique to Tamil and Sinhala in Sri Lanka. I've seen it in India and Hindi, etc. So on one hand, it's saying, don't get on a boat, you will probably perish. But it's also saying, you will not make Australia home. So we come back to the museum. I started soon after I left Australia, and I was asked to make an exhibition proposal. And I came across this pamphlet, which is 1942, and it was an exhibition on wartime housing. And if you imagine that all of the countries that we are seeing or hearing about on a regular basis, be it Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq or Sri Lanka, all these places in which war is breaking down the societal structures, even in 1942, there was a consideration of what house and housing and home might mean in the midst of war. And what I found really intriguing were these images that say, replace this with this. So you can imagine that these right-hand images are images of modernity. They're images of which we could aspire to live, unlike these cluttered houses here on the left. Or similarly, on a broader scheme, these, not these, but these. And frankly, I think we're still in this realm, wherever we go in the US. But you can see the difference, right? These houses emulate a kind of historic or historicism of what house connotes, whereas these are no roof, no pitch, and are more representative of the kind of modern flatness, if you will, the lack of facade. So what I started to think about is how we use architecture as a space of repair. And if we remember that if we've drawn a line in the landscape, we're always trying to transgress that line. We're always trying to sew things together, to bring people together, but that line remains. And so we have in the memory of our nation, in fact, our own history with which to deal, which is the encampment of, or detention of Japanese Americans. And these are amazing photos that are in the Library of Congress by Ansel Adams, who reluctantly was commissioned to document the Japanese internment camps in Manzanar in California. And so, of course, he focuses on the beautiful landscape. But in front of you, in the foreground, you're actually looking at the barracks of several thousand Japanese, and this is another one here. So for me, this started to in some way exemplify this line between the landscape, between nature and space, between a built architecture and a politics that may or may not be invisible. And that when politics is translated and transcribed onto the ground, architecture very much picks up those divisions, and rather than tries to create more space, they also collapse them. So there is a history to this. These are the studios of Cinecittà in Rome, the site where Ben-Hur and Hercules was originally filmed as a refugee camp in 1942. Similarly, the Acropolis, moving back to Athens, also a refugee camp in 1952 in the wake of war with Turkey. The interior of the opera and the main theater of Athens, where each of the once former expensive, say, ticketed boxes now become homes for individuals. And something a bit more recent, this is a 13-story high former 5-star hotel in Georgia that then was reoccupied by refugees during the Georgian War in the 80s and 90s. And in fact, the individuals and families that lived in this hotel, of course you can see it was an unfinished building that they finished. Right? And they finished it. They lived for 15 years until Radisson kicked them out. And now it's a Radisson balloon. So these are really intriguing architectural spaces, but they're spaces that don't generally get seen in the museum or in any museum. But for me, the moments in which the architecture is both a source for and a response to a certain condition becomes very intriguing. So in this case, this is in Shakila, one of the largest camps, urban camps in Beirut. And what you're looking at, these are amazing photographs, but this is the edge of the camp. These are all the stolen telephone and internet cables that they have brought from the real city into the camp so that the families and individuals can have access to telephone and television and what have you. So they're co-opting a system, they're co-opting a political space to make it their own. Similarly, we could think of architecture then as being as fragile as those limits that I had talked about earlier. Limits in which, of course, violence is always present in some form. Or the accommodation of technology to capture and to keep people in spaces. So this is a camp in Lebanon, showing a local broadcast. So in preparation for the exhibition, I basically made a trip around the world to try to document and see these places for myself. And one of the first stops I made was in Jordan. This is Al-Zafari. It is one of the largest camps in the Middle East, especially in Jordan. It now holds around 98,000 people in one camp, and then there are 2 subsequent camps that are holding around 40 to 50,000 individuals. What this means, though, is first, we have to build something here to accommodate these individuals by UN law, and yet we don't. And I started asking questions about why architects are not involved in the making of refugee camps. And I went to the High Commissioner of Refugees himself at the UN and said, why have you never asked architects to contribute to at least thinking about or proposing a new way of living for these people? And he said, it's too expensive. So what is not expensive, though, as you can see, is this standard box. It's made out of corrugated aluminum, usually with 3 windows and a door and a flat roof. And each of these boxes costs around $3,000 to $5,000. And nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries buy these boxes and then deliver them to refugee camps like this one. So you see the Saudi Arabian coat of arms here. But when it's 125 degrees and you're living with 6 children in a small metal box, what does that mean? What does it mean when there's no shade? And what I started to find was that people and ingenuity started to transform these places again to make them their own. To give you a sense just of the kind of transitoriness, this is an artist named Samuel Gretakat from Tunisia, who's also been documenting the houses that are, or the shelters that are built in the Sahara on the way to Libya. You can see that the UN is part and parcel of this kind of gathering of materials to make a temporary architecture. Or similarly, again back in Zatari, where artists, and I interviewed, there are 13 artists in the camp, who then took to painting what their memories of Syria were on the edges of the camp itself. And these are really stunning to me because on one hand, this is someone's home, a metal box, someone's home, and it becomes both a window as well as a mirror. A window into a memory that is fading very fast, if not gone altogether, but also a mirror to those people that see this space. And that architecture plays a role in that kind of projection and that understanding of temporaneity. Or this camp no longer exists, but in Calais, in France, on the closest edge of the English Channel, the last stop before many individuals would try to unsuccessfully latch on to a Channel Tunnel train and make it into the UK. This is by an artist named Henk Wildschut, who spent 10 years documenting the subsequent destruction and erasure of the camps in Calais. All of this is to say that the notion of time, of temporariness, is very much then a question of how architects and designers begin to respond to these conditions. These are questions that architects generally don't ask. The role of time. And when the average length of time for someone in a displaced condition like the camp is 17 to 19 years, living in a camp, living in a tent, we are already thinking about how architecture could respond to this. So we have a few examples. Ikea Foundation, which is the large umbrella organization that holds Ikea to a social kind of commandment, if you will, started to work on a design for a temporary shelter. It's a very politicized type of shelter, in as much as Ikea decided to get in on the business part of this and was selling this design to United Nations organizations. And these are made of individual panels that fill in a very light aluminum frame. And what we know, though, is that many of the families that occupied them were forced out of them back into tents so that the NGOs could use them for offices. And so then, again, you have this internal circulation of individuals, some of which have stayed and some of which have gone away. And those of you who know IKEA furniture, what does it do in about 3 years? It falls down. So it was a kind of ingenious plan by IKEA, and I'm not trying to disparage the company, but Better Shelter actually is known to fall apart after about 3 years. So they have to build more and keep kind of supplying the camps, as it were. So just to give you a sense of scale for a moment, here is 6 months in 2014 of El Zatari camp. El Zatari camp is on leased land from one farmer, a Jordanian farmer. It was an olive grove. They removed all of the olive trees and built a refugee camp. These, you can see that this is the original part of the camp. Up here, there's no organization necessarily. It's self-kind of defined spaces. Whereas this then is more of the UN and the Jordanian government's kind of response to that. Then I will sit down here. This is 1 month later. And this is 2 years ago, and now we know that about 20,000 individuals have been added to this space. So when we talk about home, and when we talk about shelter, and we're talking about temporary spaces, right? These are meant to keep people safe for a short period of time, and then they can go onward or go back home, hopefully. The individuals that have been living here have been here for around 10 to 12 years. It's expected they will not go back to Syria because the area in which they're from, mainly, was completely destroyed. So we're looking at what I call a Proto City, a city in the making, right? This is 100 and something thousand people, 123,000 people. And it doesn't have any services. There's only running water around the edges. And there are deliveries of food and things like that, where you wait in line and you get one piece of bread or some rice, etc. There's a little grocery store. How do we then, as planners and architects, begin to reimagine a space like this? And what has developed over time is something that this line then comes back into play. And this is Zachary from above. And that line is called the Champs-Élysées. And the Champs-Élysées is a space of free trade that is only allowed between the refugees, among the refugees. And the government and the UN agreed that they should have their own space in which commerce and commercial activities could be allowed. And it's along this one line. And so what you find there are wedding dress rentals. You find kebab stands. I had a great shave there. And so forth. And so what you start to understand then as a proto-city, as a temporary kind of space, is that individuals, people, can start to use architecture to their own advantage. They can make space on their own. And just another view of the Champs-Élysées. And you can see the extension of the camp in the distance. So Zachary is often used as an example by the UN as a successful camp. An unsuccessful camp might be Doloado in Ethiopia, one of the more violent places, because in Northeast Africa, these are tribal settlements and tribal societies that have never historically gotten along with each other. And when famine has come, these warring peoples continue to war with themselves, but in a more kind of distinct or finite space, like this one. And another camp from above. This is Kobe camp near Doloado. It can be seen from space. You can see then the city that is literally being formed from above. Or this one, Kakuma. And one of the images that I included in the exhibition, which I'll show you in a moment, is the largest camp in the world. It's 370,000 people in Kenya. It's also a space of erasure. The Kenyan government denies that it exists, even though many of us have been there. So what does this mean for the edges of our nations, the edges of our planet, the edges of our architecture, the edges that may or may not be defined by Rachel Hayes' beautiful sculptures here, or the small house outside? That architecture, when understood not as an edge, but as a seam that could potentially respond to and reflect conditions on both sides, we start to understand, on one hand, that our landscape, our contemporary global landscape, is one of violence, in as much as one of suture or being brought together. So this was the initial image for the exhibition, writ large on a wall. And I once happened to catch two young men with their phones. One was playing dead on the floor in front of this image. And I was so taken aback, I didn't know what to do with myself. But so I thought I would take you through the exhibition very briefly, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that I was then seeking. After all of that information and all of this kind of meandering around the planet in some of the most desperate places of the world. And the first things that you would see when walking into the gallery space was one of the only photos by Dorothea Lange from her Migrant Mother series, where you actually see the house that she was living in. So it has never been shown before in the museum, and it's part of the larger collection of the canonical image. And she's in her tent with her child in front of her. On the floor is a work by the Korean sculptor Do Ho-soo, a welcome mat, but it's a welcome mat in which all of the times that make up the welcome mat are made of individuals. And then on the pedestal, probably the most haunting, if you will, of objects is from our design collection, which is the arm circumference measurement bracelet. It's a device that is still used today to measure malnourishment. So for me, these were three types of bodies, if you will, that implicate every individual that could come into the gallery space. And a little bit further then, so we're looking at the back of that pedestal. It's a work by, photographic work by the artist Xaverius Simmons, fairly activist artist in terms of African American identity. On the right is a video work that everyone can access online now called The Left to Die Boat Case, which is a kind of transcription of an event in which a boat carrying around 100 people in the Mediterranean was left to sink because 3 countries' rescue teams couldn't decide who should take them. So they let the boat sink instead. And then on the left is the built version of the Better Shelter, the Ikea Foundation UNHCR shelter. One of the early works also was by the architect Teddy Cruz and his partner Juana Foreman. This is a very long photographic work of the Mexican border. It's called 60 Miles of Trans-Border Urban Conflict. You get a sense this is about this wide. And what he's done is mark 30 miles north of the border and 30 miles south of the border to document how housing in particular has transformed in and around this space of division. And a little further on was poor image, but it was a project that I commissioned from the National Union of Sahrawi Women. This is one of the oldest displaced communities on the planet in Western Sahara, in North Africa. They were literally forced out by Moroccans and Mauritanians over 50 years ago and forced to live in the desert with nothing. And I went to to their camp, and I asked them to make a map of what home represented. And for them, what they started to make, this is a full tapestry, a thick pile carpet, was the map of the space, the dimensioning of where they live. And of course, it had all of their ministries because they are a de facto displaced government, run mainly by women. But I love they added this. They didn't tell me that they were adding this. And it came to the museum, and we unrolled it, and there was a museum there. And in fact, they decided that they wanted to have the museum there. They actually do have a museum in the camp that they live in. It's where they documented the war against them. They decided, though, to put the museum that big. It's a very tiny room, but that big, because it was going to be seen in a museum. And they wanted to articulate for me and for the audience how important museums were and are to representing themselves. And a little bit further, again, you can see the Better Shelter now is open for handicapped access. In fact, when the designers were making the house, they forgot that people were in wheelchairs, and the door isn't wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair. So we opened up one of those panels, and then several standard tarpaulin from the UN, and what's called School in a Box, which is a project run by the UN that you could carry a school, all of the basic equipment for creating a classroom to displaced communities, and then teach from those materials. And I bet you're wondering, where's the architecture, right? In this case, I decided that the architecture could be something as ephemeral as Xavier Simmons' photographs. And so I tried to imagine that the grid that we saw with her work and the grid of geography could be then transposed with a collection of photos from historic and contemporary examples. So, for instance, we have the architecture here in Rwanda. We have Rohingya refugee, mobile school, Zatari, Beirut, Shatila camp here, some proposals for Berlin. But I also wanted to include examples that were, to my thinking, terrible. Really bad. So the individual that you see there is standing in front of a actual proposed box, a metal box with a door, and like a vent, that it was thought that a refugee could climb into the box and live in the box. In this case, this was an inflatable shelter for conflict zones in East Africa. And I asked the architects at one point, I said, so who blows up the house? And they said, oh, the people will love to do that. So in a way, what I tried to show in that collection of images was that the refugee, the displaced, is happening on a global scale. It's happening on every continent in various forms and various formats as well. And this is a project, again, you can access this online. It's called Refugee Republic. And it's a group of Dutch media designers that went to a camp in northern Iraq and started to draw every home, every house, every shelter, every kind of relationship that they could document in the space. And then they drew pathways through it. And what you find in the online version is that you were walking along these paths, doors open, and you hear music, you hear conversation, you see what people are cooking with, you see their kitchens, and it immediately starts to not only domesticate, but personalize these conditions, because up to now, we would only have marked out bodies rather than actually experienced the connection of bodies. And so that was accessible here in the exhibition as well. And your pathway through that camp then was projected on the floor. And just nearing the end now, two works. One of the criticisms of this exhibition was that I relied on photojournalism. Well, there's only one photograph by a photojournalist who's also an artist. And it really has always bothered me that would not be seen as art somehow. But that is the image of Dadaab in Kenya, the place that the Kenyan government denies exists. And on the floor is a lightbox work by Tiffany Chung. She is a Vietnamese artist, Vietnamese-American artist, who herself and her family were refugees on an island in Hong Kong Harbor for a number of years before they were allowed to reach the U.S. In fact, she's considered a boat person from the 70s. And this is a close-up of that work. These are images of the city of Homs and Aleppo in Syria. And a lot of people imagined this work like lanterns, like gravestones, like markers floating on a sea. And right outside of the doors of the gallery, in the place where you could move from one exhibition to another, I had to do an intervention of some sort, because it's also across from the main staff elevators. This is called The List. It's not a work of art. It is a 30-page, or now it's much more, but it was at that time a 30-page spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, of every monitored, marked death in transit. And there were over 100,000 people marked as a kind of, in a way, a kind of memorial, but also what you start to find when you read this document is that people have names, they have origins, they have a desire to leave, they have a desire to move, they are of all ages. So at the top, the third line down, is 820 men and women and children who perished at sea. And we know where all of these things happen because when unidentified bodies wash up on the shore, they are cataloged. And they're cataloged by the organization that maintains this list. And it is an ongoing, daily, updated list. So it brings me to the last two images. I wanted to come back in a way full circle to where we are and where we are in this vast kind of intersecting set of violent lines. That our geographies are invented and rewritten and redrawn on a regular basis. These geographies happen on the national and the continental level as much as they happen on the city, county, and individual level. That we, in effect, are embodying all of these kind of conflicts and these lines and these spaces. And so this work is a commissioned work by the Indian artist Reena Kalat. And she spent 3 weeks with me, and us, I should say, sewing this map onto the wall. And it's hard to see in this light, but it is a map of the world, obviously. And it is made out of telephone wire. And she takes the telephone wire and ties knots in it to look like barbed wire. So that all of the continents and all of the spaces between the continents are this barbed wire that is not easily transgressed or moved across. And then she takes all of the main lines of remittances, of finances that are being transmitted across the continents, across the world, and overlays that map with those. And then the last thing is that all of those wires are connected to a speaker system that was playing on a loop throughout the entire exhibition of migrating birds, of ships at night, of the sound of footsteps. So in a way that the soundtrack, as much as the map, is our backdrop, is our understanding of these movements as we go through the museum. So when we used to imagine that our countries and our states were housing us, they were sheltering us, they were keeping us safe and secure, so too did we imagine that architecture could do the same thing. But arguably, for the 65.7 million individuals and counting today, that shelter is precarious and fragile as we are. So, thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Sean's agreed to take. And very provocative talk, and especially we're grateful for the walk through the exhibition that is both moving and I think incredibly thought-provoking. So thank you for that. Questions for Sean?
Anything?
This is a simple question.
Yes, sir.
Some of these boxes have windows and others not. For me, a window is a minimum part of having decent shelter.
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering what the stories are. If you look at that hotel, that perhaps is coincident for the hotel, that had a lot of windows, a couple of others. Most of them didn't.
That's right. That's right. I think in the context of say, well, we'll look at this shelter for a moment, for the better shelter. There is a window. You could cover it as well. So in certain contexts, privacy is paramount. So in Arab context in particular, privacy is very much the basis of which shelter is constructed. But we're also in contexts in which there are huge dust storms. Sound familiar, right? Dust storms in the context of Zaatari, for instance, or in Jordan and Lebanon, come through at such a furious rate that a lot of the individuals I interviewed didn't want windows. And because the boxes are so hot, they couldn't open the windows because the dust would come in. So it's a struggle, right? So what Better Shelter and Ikea did actually was create a screen, and then the screen has a flap on both sides that you could have a window or not, as the case may be. But you're absolutely right. You need air, you need light, but you also need this sense of security. And what I found in doing research in all of these places and then talking to designers, often a door with a lock is what people really wanted. That they could lock themselves in as much as lock people out. Right? So even on that scale, that threshold that defines mine and yours, or what's not mine and yours, becomes an instance in which architecture and design has to play a role. How do you design a lock? In this case, a lock made out of PVC that is also secure. Because a tent, which is the standard issue tent that these individuals are given upon arriving in a camp, the UN gives them a polyethylene tent. You're usually in a tent for 3 to 5 years before you're given a metal box. And many people that I spoke to, both in East Africa and in Jordan, would say that the lock being the most important thing, if they could figure out a way to lock their tent, they would have stayed in the tent. Because a tent actually, moves with wind and actually could have air and light, whereas the metal box really doesn't accommodate that. So these are really fundamental design issues and questions, I think. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
There was a book a few years ago, I'm not sure the title, it might have been This Mercedes is Not for Sale, called Refugee Republic in Africa.
Right.
And one of the comments that he made was how little the people had,
Yeah.
but how he felt that they were happier than Western Europeans or Western
Sure.
culture. Pretty depressing thought on your part. But
Yeah, sorry. It's Saturday.
what happiness, if any, did you find, and what expectations do these people have from the rest of the world
Yeah.
to make things better?
Yeah. SAD doesn't cut it when you're working with these individuals. Depressing. I'm sorry to bring your weekends down here for a bit, but what was remarkable to me is resilience, first of all, They have survived crossing some of the most hostile landscapes in the world, whether it's deserts or war, to reach these spaces in which they are, while yes, they are accommodated and yes, they are protected to a certain degree, they're also not really livable, per se. And what I found with many of the individuals who had been in the camps the longest, they were resigned to be in the camps for as long as it took. The younger people that I would meet, the teenagers, the 20-year-olds, often, because of their phones, have seen images of the world outside and were desperate to leave and desperate to escape, even though they weren't really allowed to do so. And there are many cases in which individuals in Dadaab, for instance, because there is some protection on the edges of that camp, that these kids would leave the camp, they would arrive in Nairobi. They were Somali, so Somalis are more or less kind of targeted individuals, race-wise. And they would realize that their escape really hadn't brought them anything except more danger, and they would come back. You also have examples in which individuals who have been in Dadaab is 35 years old, not 5 years old, 35 years old. There have been births in the camps that these children have grown up in the camp. It's all they know. And they have left by, say, a visa lottery or a work visa or even an education visa. But they have to go back there because that's where their families are. So it's created a very problematic paradigm in which these countries and nations, in order to separate these people, have created, again, these cities. But the cities don't constitute cities because they're all considered temporary. So it's a very odd, complex cycle in which nations and the UN should, in my mind, determine that these are cities, make them cities, and therefore create an infrastructure in and around those cities so that the individuals could be content, or more content, as the case may be. But in the Australian context, the reason why I focus so much on that is that those individuals, a few of which have now been allowed to move to Florida, by the way, all spoke to the fact that they never knew what the future would be. They never knew. Because the buildings were temporary, the sites were temporary, the laws were temporary, their lives were temporary. So to me, it begins a whole set of other questions about how we regard ourselves as humans, right? That we're so kind of fixed within our own notions of time. And that time often brings contentment in as much as shelter does. I don't know if that answered your question. Yes, sir.
I haven't heard the word Palestine.
Right. Sorry?
I haven't heard the word Palestine. I haven't heard, are any of these camps Palestinian refugee camps?
Absolutely. So Shatila, the camp that I was showing the wires, was one of the first Palestinian camps in Lebanon. And the intriguing thing about Shatila for me is that it was a space that was allotted within the city of Beirut with the idea that all of the new commercial development and residential development being built around it would erase it. So there's a whole idea of what you don't see. All of these camps obviously are way out in the desert or in a landscape, inhospitable landscape, because the public won't see it then. In the case of Lebanon and Jordan, well, Lebanon per capita has the highest number of refugees in the world for such a small country, and they do a very good job of allowing people not to see them, Palestinians in this case. And so architecture of the city becomes part of that question as well. And there was an image in the exhibition that I showed of the first camp in Palestine as well. Yes.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
Well, there's two, but you can answer one if you want.
Yeah.
Are there any countries in history where migration was done in a more logical, humane way that's good for all involved, or is it just currently so impossible due to the sheer numbers? And also, is there a magic number or correlation between population density and violence?
Wow. You prepared those.
Just like
Well, I'll try to answer the second question first.
Okay.
I think violence is all around us, whether we like it or not, and whether we assume it's there or not. So I don't think violence is something that is dependent necessarily on population. Or density. And that's why this kind of thinking around line and division and mapping and kind of geography speaks more to not the people, but to a violence that is being inscribed in the landscape, as it were. So there's a number of scholars who write about the Middle East and the geography of the Middle East as being an invented geography. Because at some point, under British occupation and mandates, a group of men sat down and decided that that line would become the border of Syria, that line would become the border of Yemen, and so forth. So we have nation states that are defining their edges, right? Which is, by all means, a kind of identifier of nationalism, of nationhood, but it also speaks to division, right? So a kind of violence. The first question, I have to remember what the first question was, but...
Is it in any time in history where migration was done on a successful level?
I suspect that there has been, but it's very hard to find, and I would imagine that it's happened on such a microscopic level that perhaps it worked. Mm-hmm. But I think of examples in which, like in South Asia, in partition, when the British left East and West Pakistan and India, and you had the largest migration of individuals, forced migration of individuals, it was one of the most deadly examples. I think also just historically, we see more than we ever have before, by virtue of our phones, by virtue of satellite imagery, by virtue of technology. And our relationship to what we see has changed as well. And this goes for violence, this goes for everything that we are encountering as societies. And I think that it, in part, is related to a kind of desensitization of violence, on one hand, but also a kind of, how do we advocate for people that we don't necessarily understand or recognize, even? And I think that's where this question of who is a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, is so much related to who we are. Doesn't matter where we are, but who we are, right? And that we all create, make, define, and register home and shelter in unique ways that are specific to us. But that's where architects, I think, can step in and begin to respond to these conditions in far more humane ways.
So thank you, and thank you to all of you for coming out and helping us think about this question of home today. Home is this, as Sean just said, this deeply human condition for us, and it's not like we've solved it. It's thousands of years old. We're struggling with it right now. I'm very grateful to you, Sean, for coming and helping us think a little bit about it, and to do so in this amazing context here at 108, where we have all kinds of pieces that are reflecting on home, and with Patrick Doherty arriving soon to think, there's photographs are around us here to see how this question lives, at that satellite level down to the very human lived level of, did you put put a tent in the window in the refugees tent. These are just, I think, important questions for us to see and be thinking about. So thank you all for coming out. Again,
Thank you.
Sean.